The horse bolted out from under Teresa Whittaker before she could even draw a breath to scream, and by the time she found her voice, the gelding was already tearing down the muddy slope toward Cache Fork, its ears flat, its eyes white-rimmed with a terror she could not name. She had only meant to walk him to the water trough behind the mercantile. A jackrabbit had shot from the brush, and that had been the end of any calm morning at all. Now the reins were gone from her hands, the saddle horn slamming into her ribs with every stride, and the roar ahead of her was not thunder but the swollen, snow-fed rush of the creek at full flood, brown and fast and hungry, where the low crossing used to be. She heard hooves behind her, a second set, closing hard. Teresa, pull him left toward the willows. She knew the voice before she placed the face, some deep part of her chest recognizing it a half-breath before her mind caught up, and there was no time to marvel at that, no time for anything but hauling on what rein she still held, dragging the gelding's head around by main strength while the man on the bay horse came up alongside her, boot to boot, and reached across the gap between the two animals to seize her bridle strap with a grip like iron. Whoa now. Whoa. I have got you, whoa. The gelding fought him for 3 strides, 4, hooves throwing up gouts of black mud not 10 feet from the churning brown water. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the animal's panic broke, and he slowed and stopped, sides heaving, not 20 feet from where the current would have swept both horse and rider under the flooded ford and down through the rocks below. Teresa sat frozen for a moment, chest working like a bellows, before she looked over at the man who had ridden her down. He was not a boy anymore. That was the first thought that came to her, foolish as it was in the middle of such a fright. Joseph Townsend had grown into his shoulders since she had last laid eyes on him, and the sun had put a permanent brown into his face, and there was a scar through one eyebrow that had not been there when they were both children chasing barn cats through her father's stable in Independence, Missouri. But the eyes were the same warm brown, steady on her now with an intensity that made her suddenly conscious of her heart still hammering. "Joseph," she said, and it came out half a laugh and half a sob. "Joseph Townsend. You always did pick the worst horses to ride, Teresa Whittaker," he said, and there was a tremor under the teasing that told her he had been every bit as frightened as she had. 15 years, and I find you again about to drown in Cache Fork. I was not going to drown. I had it entirely under control. Sure you did." He swung down from his own horse and came around to steady her gelding while she got her breath, his hand resting a moment too long against her knee before he seemed to remember himself and stepped back. "You are shaking. So would you be." She managed to get her leg over and slide down, her boots sinking an inch into the wet ground, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, only stood there with the flooded creek roaring past a stone's throw away, spring runoff pouring down out of the mountains the way it did every year about this time, turning the low ford into something no sane rider would attempt. Fair, bright weather overhead, not a cloud in the whole blue reach of Colorado sky, and death had nearly taken her anyway, quietly, the way the mountains always seemed to keep a little violence tucked behind their beauty. "What in the name of anything are you doing in Silver Bend?" she finally asked. "Same as half of Colorado, I expect, following the silver." He nodded toward the wooden telegraph shack that sat at the edge of town, its single wire running off toward the pass. "Only I am not digging for it. I read wire for the Western Union office. Have been 3 months now." "You, reading wire?" She could not entirely hide her surprise, and he caught it, and something flickered across his face there and gone. "A man's leg does not always agree with the trail forever," he said, lightly enough, but she heard the catch beneath it and did not push. Not yet. There would be time, she told herself, though she could not have said why she was already so certain of that. "Well," she said instead, reaching up to catch her gelding's cheek strap, steadying herself against the animal's warm neck. "I am glad it is you sitting at that key, then. I would have hated to owe my life to a stranger." "You owe me nothing," Joseph said, and something in his voice made the words land heavier than she expected. I would have ridden into that creek myself before I let it take you." She looked at him for a long moment, the water rushing behind them, the sun warm on her shoulders, and told herself it was only the fright still working its way out of her blood that made her feel, for just a moment, as though the last 15 years had folded up like a letter and put themselves away. The Whitaker Mercantile and Freight Company occupied the largest false-fronted building on Ledger Street, 2 stories of raw pine lumber that still smelled of sap in places, its shelves crowded with everything a silver camp needed and could not grow or make for itself. Bolts of cloth, tinned oysters, kegs of blasting powder kept carefully separate from the flour, boots in every size a miner might need, and behind the counter, in a ledger book bound in oiled leather, the true engine of the place, which was not the goods on the shelves but the contracts that brought them up from the railhead at Granite Junction, 31 miles down a canyon road that had in the last year become the most dangerous stretch of ground in that part of the territory. Teresa's father had built the business from a single freight wagon in 1874, and when the fever took him 2 winters past, he had left it to her outright in his will, every share and every debt, because he had trusted no one else in the world to run it as it deserved to be run. The trouble was that the law, and more particularly the men who did business with the law, trusted her rather less than her father had. And so her father's older brother, Walter Whitaker, had come out from Kansas to stand as her guardian in matters of contract and signature, a kindly enough man, honest by his own lights, but slow with figures and slower still to believe that his niece understood the freight business better than any man in Silver Bend. "You cannot simply refuse to pay Ferris's toll," Walter said that evening, pacing behind the counter while Teresa went over the week's manifests by lamplight. "The man controls Bear Canyon Road. There is no other way up from Granite Junction unless you want to lose 3 days going around by Ute Pass, and even then we would arrive to find our goods spoiled or stolen regardless, because the moment a shipment leaves that road it becomes fair game for whoever is watching it. I have read the manifest losses for the last 4 months, Uncle Walter. We have paid Nathaniel Ferris $940 in what he calls tolls, and we have still lost 2 wagons outright to what he calls accidents. He offers protection. He offers extortion and calls it protection because Marshall Dunlap has decided not to notice the difference." She closed the ledger with a snap that made her uncle flinch. "I have seen the marshal's account at the assay office, Uncle Walter. He has been depositing sums no marshal's salary could explain, always within days of a Ferris toll collection. I have added the numbers 3 times to be certain. I was not simply hoping to see something that was not there." Walter Whitaker sat down heavily on a barrel of nails, looking older than his 51 years. "Even if you are right, girl, what would you have us do? Ride down to Denver and demand the governor send troops for 1 Silver Camps Road? We would starve waiting on that kind of justice." "I do not know yet," Teresa admitted, and it cost her something to say it. "But I intend to find out. And I intend to have proof before I accuse a man wearing a badge of anything, because an accusation without proof will only see us both run out of this town, and this store is all Father left me to hold on to." It was, in fact, a young telegraph messenger named Petey Coombs who first mentioned to Teresa, entirely without meaning to alarm her, that Mr. Townsend down at the wire office had been asking careful questions about which nights the Whitaker freight wagons generally rolled in from Granite Junction, and had seemed, Petey said, awful interested in the answer for a man who only worked the key. Teresa found Joseph 3 evenings later exactly where Petey had said she would, seated at his desk in the small frame telegraph office with its single window looking out on Ledger Street, the brass sounder clicking out its private language while he transcribed with a pencil in quick, economical strokes. A man who looked entirely at home doing careful, patient work with his hands, though there was a restlessness in the set of his shoulders that told her the stillness did not come naturally to him. "You have been asking about my freight schedule," she said without preamble, closing the door behind her. Joseph did not look up until he had finished the line he was transcribing. Then he set down his pencil and regarded her with an expression she could not immediately read. "I have." "Why?" "Because 3 nights ago I decoded a private message that was not meant for this office at all. Only the line runs through my key whether Ferris's man in Granite Junction likes it or not. And I have been sitting on it for 3 days trying to decide whether telling you would put you in more danger than staying quiet." He rubbed a hand across his jaw, the lamp beside him throwing his face half into shadow. "I am telling you now because I cannot sit on it any longer and sleep." Teresa felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "Tell me." "Marshall Dunlap wired Nathaniel Ferris the schedule of your next silver payroll shipment out of Granite Junction, the one due up Bear Canyon Road in 4 days' time, along with word that your uncle intends to run it without paying toll this trip on account of the store's accounts being short." Ferris wired back one word. Joseph's jaw tightened. "Raid." The silence in the little office stretched long enough that the ticking of the brass sounder seemed loud as gunfire. 4 days, Teresa said finally. 4 days. They mean to hit the wagons at Widow's Bend, where the road narrows against the rock face and there is nowhere to run to. I have ridden that stretch scouting cattle trail since I got here, Teresa, and I promise you there is no worse place in that canyon to be caught with a loaded wagon and no cover. Then we do not run that shipment on schedule. You cannot simply hold it back either. Ferris will know within a day that you have caught Wise, and next time he will not announce himself by wire. He will simply come, and he will come angrier for having been made to look a fool. Joseph stood, and for the first time she saw the faint hitch in his gait as he crossed toward her, an old injury he did not favor so much as simply carry, the way a man carries a memory. "I think you run it, but not the way Ferris expects. I think you run it with more guns than he thinks you have, and I think I am one of them. You are a telegraph operator, Joseph, not a gunfighter. I was a cattle drover for 9 years before I was a telegraph operator, Teresa. I have carried a rifle across 3 states, and I have put down men who meant worse to my herd than Ferris means to your wagons. I did not stop being able to shoot straight the day I sat down at that key." Something raw moved behind his eyes. "I stopped riding drives because a stampede outside Trinidad broke this leg in 4 places, and the surgeon in Pueblo told me plainly I would never sit a hard-running horse the same way again. He was near enough right, but near enough is not the same as unable, and I will not stand behind that window and listen to the wire tell me what happened to you on that road while I did nothing." She looked at him a long moment, this man who had been a skinny, laughing boy the last time she had truly known him, who had grown into someone quiet and watchful and evidently more capable of both tenderness and violence than she had had any reason to expect. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked slowly. "What happens to me?" Joseph was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Because I have thought of you more times in 15 years than I have ever admitted to another living soul," he said finally, "and I am not about to lose the chance to know you again to a man like Nathaniel Ferris." Teresa Whittaker had built her whole adult life on the careful reading of contracts, on knowing precisely what a man meant beneath what he said, and she heard the truth in that plainly enough to feel it land somewhere beneath her ribs. But there was no time that evening to examine what it meant, not with 4 days standing between her and an ambush at Widow's Bend, and so she only nodded once and said, "Then you had better tell me everything you know about that stretch of road, Joseph Townsend, because I intend for Nathaniel Ferris to be the one surprised this time." The wagons rolled out of Granite Junction on the 4th morning exactly as the false schedule Teresa had arranged for Marshall Dunlap to overhear would have it, loaded, so far as any watching eye could tell, with the quarter's silver payroll bound for Silver Bend. In truth, the strongbox riding in the lead wagon held nothing but stove bolts and river gravel, while the actual payroll had gone up 2 days early, hidden beneath sacks of flour in an ordinary supply wagon that had drawn no attention at all. What the decoy wagons did carry, tucked beneath canvas and blankets, was every man Teresa and Joseph had been able to gather and trust in 4 days. Her Uncle Walter with a shotgun he had not fired since Kansas, 2 of her freight drivers, the blacksmith's grown son, and Joseph Townsend riding drag on his bay horse, a Winchester across his saddle bow, watching the canyon walls close in around them as they came up on the tight bend the drovers called Widow's Bend, for the wagons it had claimed over the years. "Easy now," Joseph called forward low, as the rock walls rose up on either side, narrowing the road to barely 2 wagon widths, the creek below running loud enough to cover most other sound. "This is the place." Teresa, riding beside the lead wagon rather than in it, because she had refused flatly to sit hidden while her own goods and her own gamble played out around her, felt her heart climb into her throat as the first rifle shot cracked out from the rocks above. Down. Joseph's shout cut across the canyon a half-second before the driver of the lead wagon threw himself flat against the boards, and then the road erupted into chaos, 6 or 7 mounted men spilling down out of the brush on the canyon's north side, Nathaniel Ferris himself unmistakable at their head in his flat black hat, shouting for the wagons to halt. They did not halt. Joseph had planned for this too, and the drivers whipped the mules forward instead, into the ambush rather than away from it, because a wagon standing still in that narrow space was a wagon that could be surrounded, while a wagon moving hard through it had at least the chance of breaking clear on the far side. Walter Whitaker's shotgun boomed from beneath the canvas of the second wagon, and one of Ferris's riders' horses reared and threw him clear into the brush. Teresa fired her father's old revolver twice, more to keep heads down than in any real hope of hitting a man at that range from a moving horse, and beside her Joseph's rifle spoke twice, 3 times, his aim far steadier than hers, and a rider she recognized from town, one of Ferris's paid guns named Croft, dropped his own weapon and clutched at his shoulder with a howl. "Ferris!" Joseph's voice carried over the gunfire hard and clear. "There is no payroll in those wagons. You have been made a fool of, same as Dunlap made a fool of you, and every man riding with you today is doing it for stove bolts and river rock." It was not entirely true, not yet, but the confusion it bought was real enough. 2 of Ferris's riders pulled up short, exchanging uncertain looks, and in that gap Joseph put his bay horse straight at Nathaniel Ferris himself, closing the distance before Ferris could bring his own rifle to bear, until the 2 men were near enough that Joseph simply reached across and wrenched the weapon from Ferris's hands by main force, the 2 horses colliding shoulder to shoulder, both riders nearly unseated. "You have got no claim on this road, Ferris," Joseph said, breathing hard, his own rifle now leveled at the outlaw's chest, "and you have got no marshal's badge either, whatever Dunlap thinks he is selling you. This is the last wagon of Teresa Whitaker's you will ever lay hands on." Ferris, a lean, weathered man with pale eyes and a scar-seamed jaw, looked past Joseph to where Teresa sat her horse, revolver still raised, breathing hard, unbowed, and something like genuine respect moved briefly across his cruel features before it hardened again into contempt. "You have won yourself one morning, girl," Ferris said. "You have not won the road. There is no getting Silver up from Granite Junction except through Bear Canyon, and I intend to still be sitting on it long after your telegraph man there has bled out on it defending you." "Then it is fortunate for both of us," Teresa said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that I do not intend to keep using your road at all." She did not yet know, in that moment, exactly what she meant by the words, but she would within a matter of days, and it would change everything that followed. They buried nothing that day, for no one on their side had died, though Walter Whitaker's shoulder had taken a graze that would ache for a week, and the blacksmith's son had a bullet hole clean through his hat brim that he would tell the story of for the rest of his life. Ferris and his remaining riders had broken off the fight once the ambush had plainly failed, melting back up into the rocks the way they had come, and the wagons had rolled on into Silver Bend by nightfall to a town already buzzing with word of what had happened at Widow's Bend. It was at the town meeting 3 nights later, held in the unfinished shell of the new miners' hall with its raw lumber walls still weeping sap in the lamplight, that Teresa learned exactly how deep the corruption ran, and exactly how little the ordinary machinery of law could be trusted to dig it out. "I have called for a proper investigation into Marshall Dunlap's conduct," said the mayor, a nervous, portly man named Harmon Gilfil who owned the assay office, and therefore had every reason not to want any investigation reaching too near his own ledgers. "And the marshal has assured this council that any appearance of impropriety is easily explained." "Easily explained," Teresa repeated from where she stood near the front of the crowded hall, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned from her father that a quiet voice in an angry room commanded more attention than a loud one. "Marshall Dunlap has deposited $1,100 at the assay office in the last 5 months, in sums that match, almost to the dollar, the toll collections Nathaniel Ferris is known to take from every freight outfit running Bear Canyon Road. I have the assay office's own deposit slips, Mr. Gilfil, copied faithfully from your own clerk's book, and I am prepared to read every figure aloud to this hall, unless someone in this room can explain to me what Marshall's salary in the territory of Colorado pays $1,100 beyond ordinary wages in 5 months. The hall had gone very quiet. Marshal Otis Dunlap, standing near the back with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, did not meet her eyes. "This is a woman's grievance against a lawful toll," Dunlap said finally, though there was less certainty in it than there might have been a week earlier, before Widow's Bend had become common knowledge across the camp. "Ferris holds a franchise granted by the county to maintain that road." "A franchise," Joseph Townsend said, standing now beside Teresa though she had not asked him to, "that this county never actually granted, Marshall, because I rode to Granite Junction myself 2 days past and asked the county clerk to show me the paper. There is no such franchise on record. There never was one. Ferris invented it, and you have been collecting your share of a lie." A murmur ran through the crowd, ugly and low, the sound of men who had been paying a toll for a year on the strength of nothing at all. "Then what would you have this town do?" Gilfil demanded, sweating despite the cool evening. "Defy Ferris outright with what? A blacksmith's son and a telegraph key. He will burn every wagon that tries the canyon." It was here that Teresa Whittaker, who had spent 2 sleepless nights bent over her father's old maps and the original town charter she had found buried in the mercantile strongbox, laid the second half of her plan before the hall. "Bear Canyon Road is not the only road to Granite Junction," she said. "It is only the only road anyone has used since Ferris came to this camp, because the old ford at Cash Fork has been impassable every spring for lack of a bridge, and because the original wagon trail around the North Bench has gone to brush from disuse. My father's charter for this store, dated the year this town was founded, grants right-of-way along that North Bench trail in perpetuity, signed by the original town commissioners before Silver Bend ever had a marshal at all. If we build a bridge over Cash Fork where the old ford sits, we open a second route to the railhead that Nathaniel Ferris does not control and never can, because it never belonged to him, or to anyone but this town." "A bridge," someone called from the back, skeptical. "Over Cash Fork. That water runs 8 feet deep and fast as a shot in spring." "It does," Joseph said, "and by high summer it will run 2 feet deep and slow as a mill pond, same as every year, and there is timber enough on the north slope to frame a bridge sound enough to carry a loaded wagon, if there are enough hands willing to cut it and enough backs willing to raise it. I have built worse across worse water on cattle drives, with half the tools this town has sitting in its own lumber yard." It was not an easy thing, convincing a hall full of frightened, toll-weary men that the answer to an outlaw's grip on the only road was to build another road entirely, out of raw timber and their own 2 hands, in defiance of a man who had already shown he would meet defiance with rifle fire. But Teresa Whittaker had spent her whole life reading what men needed to hear in order to sign a contract they were afraid to sign. And by the time the meeting broke well past midnight, she had commitments of labor, if not yet of courage, from better than a dozen men in that hall, with Walter Whittaker, shoulders still bandaged, the very first to pledge his back to the work. The bridge became, over the following 2 weeks, the whole occupation of Silver Bend's daylight hours, and it became, though neither Teresa nor Joseph spoke of it plainly at first, the occupation of a great many of its evenings besides. They worked from first light most days, Joseph directing the framing with the easy authority of a man who had spent 9 years solving exactly this kind of problem on the trail: how to get heavy, awkward, unforgiving materials across moving water with nothing but ropes, mules, and stubbornness, while Teresa managed everything else that made the work possible. The lumber contracts, the daily wage her father's old accounts could just barely stretch to cover, the careful diplomacy required to keep a dozen exhausted, frightened men from losing heart every time word came that Ferris's riders had been seen watching the work from the ridgeline above. Because Ferris was watching. That much became plain within the first few days, riders visible at dusk along the tree line, never quite close enough to challenge, never quite far enough away to ignore, and it was this that made the night watches necessary, 2 men at a time, armed, walking the perimeter of the half-built bridge and the stacked lumber that represented every dollar and every hope the town had put into the venture. It was on the 4th night of watches that Teresa insisted on taking her own turn, over her uncle's considerable objection, and it was Joseph who fell into rotation beside her, the 2 of them walking the frost-edged bank of Cache Fork in the deep quiet after midnight, the mountains black shapes against a sky thick with more stars than either of them had words for. "You did not have to volunteer for this," Joseph said, breaking a silence that had gone on comfortably for the better part of an hour. "Your uncle would sit your watch himself if you asked him." "I did not ask to be protected from my own bridge, Joseph." She said it without heat, only tired amusement. "I have spent my whole life being told that a certain kind of danger belongs to men, and a certain kind of ledger belongs to men, and I have spent nearly as long proving to my own uncle that I can read a contract better than he can, let alone hold a rifle steady enough to matter. I did not come this far to sit by the fire while the thing I built is threatened." "No," Joseph agreed, and there was something like admiration in it, unguarded in the darkness in a way it might not have been in daylight. "I do not suppose you did." They walked on a while, the creek running dark and quick beside them, still swollen but dropping day by day toward the manageable depth that would let the last pilings be set. "Can I ask you something?" Teresa said eventually, "about the leg." Joseph's step did not falter, but she felt something in him go still all the same. "You can ask. You said a stampede outside Trinidad broke it. You never said how." He was quiet long enough that she thought perhaps she had asked wrong, pressed on something better left alone. But then he began speaking, low and even, the way a man speaks when he has turned a memory over so many times in solitude that the sharp edges have worn down to something he can finally hold without cutting himself. "We were driving 1,100 head up from the Cimarron country, bound for the rail pens outside Trinidad, and we had a green rider that year, a boy no older than 17, riding drag on a horse he did not have the sense to keep quiet around. A rattler spooked his mount at dusk, right at the edge of the herd, and 1,100 head of longhorn do not need much more excuse than that to run. I was riding point when it started, and by the time I got turned and back along the flank, the whole herd was pouring through a dry wash in the dark, and that boy's horse had gone down under him." Joseph's jaw worked. "I got him up behind my saddle. I did not get us both clear in time. My horse went down in a badger hole at a dead run, and the herd went over the top of us, and the only reason either of us is alive to tell it is that we came down in a hollow deep enough the cattle jumped rather than trampled straight through." "Joseph." Her voice had gone soft. The boy walked away without a scratch on him. I did not walk at all for 4 months, and the surgeon in Pueblo told me plainly that leg would never again trust a horse running flat out beneath a stampede, not the way it needed to be trusted to ride drive. He was not wrong. I tried twice more before I gave it up for good, and both times the leg near buckled under me at the wrong moment, and a trail boss cannot afford a hand whose body might fail him at the one moment a whole herd's safety depends on him. He looked out at the dark water. I have not told many people that story straight through. Most folks in this camp think I simply preferred a quieter trade. Why tell me? He turned to look at her then, and even in the starlight she could see something open and unguarded in his face that had not been there even at the height of the fight at Widow's Bend. Because you asked plainly, and because I find I do not want there to be things you do not know about me, Teresa. I have spent 15 years being a man nobody from my old life would recognize, and you are the first person in all that time who makes me want to be known again. The creek ran on beside them, quiet now, nearly gentle, and Teresa found she had stepped closer to him without entirely deciding to, close enough to feel the warmth of him against the night's chill. I have a confession of my own, then, she said. I am afraid some days that every man in this camp only respects the figures in my ledger because my father's name is still on the door, and that the day I fail even once, they will remember I am only a woman who was allowed to keep her father's store out of pity, and nothing I have built will matter at all. That is not true, Joseph said, low and fierce. I have watched you face down Ferris on that road and Guilful in that hall, and I have watched you keep a dozen frightened men working on faith alone for 2 weeks running, and there is not one thing pitiable about any of it, Teresa. You are the most capable person I have ever known, man or woman, and I would follow your lead into worse than Bear Canyon without a second thought. She looked up at him, and the distance between them, which had already grown small, closed the rest of the way without either of them quite deciding it should, until his hand came up to rest along her jaw, warm and careful, as though she were something he had waited a very long time to be allowed to touch. Teresa, he said, her name a question. Yes, she said, before he had even finished asking it, and then his mouth found hers, gentle at first, and then with a hunger 15 years in the building, and the creek ran on past them in the dark, and the half-built bridge stood silent and waiting behind them, and for a long, suspended moment neither outlaw nor corrupt marshal nor any danger in the whole territory of Colorado seemed to matter at all. They did not speak of it again that night, not because either regretted it, but because there was a kind of understanding that passed between them afterward that needed no further words, only the warmth of his hand finding hers as they finished their rounds, only the way she let her shoulder rest against his arm as they watched the last hour of their watch tick away before the next pair of men came to relieve them. But danger, in Silver Bend that spring, never stayed quiet for long. It was 6 days later, with the bridge's frame near enough complete that only the decking remained, that Petey Coombs came pounding down Ledger Street on a borrowed horse. He clearly had no business riding at such speed, shouting for Joseph Townsend before he had even properly reined in. Mr. Townsend, Mr. Townsend, there is a herd coming down off the north bench, a big one moving wrong, and Sheriff Ferris's men are riding behind it. Ferris is no sheriff, Joseph said automatically, already moving toward his horse, but say the rest of it plain, Petey. What do you mean moving wrong? Stampeding, sir. Somebody has stampeded a whole herd of cattle right down the North Bench Trail, and it is headed straight for the bridge crossing, and for the town behind it. Teresa was already at the mercantile's door, drawn by the shouting, and she took in the scene in an instant. Joseph swinging up onto his bay horse, his face gone hard and focused in a way she recognized now as the particular calm of a man who has faced exactly this danger before and knows precisely how much it can cost. How many head? She called, running for her own horse. 300, maybe more by the dust of it, Petey gasped. Somebody drove a herd up from the flats and turned it loose right at the bench, deliberate like, folks are saying. Ferris, Joseph said grimly, swinging up. He cannot stop the bridge with men now that the town has turned against him, so he means to drown the whole crossing in stampeding cattle instead, and take the bridge and half the lumber yard down with it. Teresa, you cannot ride into a running herd. It is not like turning a spooked gelding. There is no reasoning a herd like that once it commits to a direction. I have watched my father's freight mules handle worse than a single spooked animal, Teresa said, already mounted. Her chin set in a way Joseph had come to recognize meant argument was a waste of breath. I am not asking your permission, Joseph Townsend. I am asking which side of that herd you intend to work, so I can take the other. He looked at her one long moment, weighing fear against faith. And then, because he had already learned in these last weeks that Teresa Whittaker's judgment deserved trust rather than protection, he nodded once. The bench trail splits at the burned pine, half a mile above the crossing. If we can get riders on both flanks before the herd reaches that split, we can bend them wide around the town toward the open flats south of Cache Fork instead of straight through the crossing. It will take hard riding and harder nerve. Stay wide of the leaders, work the flank, and for the love of every saint in heaven, do not let your horse get boxed against brush with cattle coming on behind you. Then let us ride, Teresa said, and they went. The herd, when they reached it, was a rolling brown thunder filling the whole width of the bench trail, dust rising in a pale column visible even from town. The bawling of frightened cattle nearly drowning the shouts of the 2 or 3 riders Ferris had sent to keep them running true. Joseph peeled off toward the near flank without hesitation, and Teresa, heart hammering but hands steady on the reins, took the far side, exactly as they had agreed, pushing her horse up alongside the outermost line of running cattle and beginning the slow, dangerous work of crowding them a few degrees at a time, away from a straight line toward the crossing. It was Walter Whittaker, of all people, who came pounding up from town with 3 other men on horseback, having seen the dust and guessed its meaning, and threw himself into the effort on the near flank alongside Joseph, shotgun forgotten, working purely with his horse and his voice, and the sheer bodily nerve of pressing a half-ton of frightened animals sideways by force of will. Turn them at the split. Joseph bellowed, his bay horse lathered white with effort, keeping pace along the herd's shoulder as the burned pine came into view ahead, the trail forking there, one branch running down toward the bridge crossing, the other bending wide south toward open, empty flatland. Teresa, now push them now, hard as you can. Teresa put her heels to her horse and rode in closer than any sane accounting of danger would have allowed, close enough to feel the heat and stink of the herd, close enough that a single misstep by her mount would have put her under 1,000 pounds of panicked cattle, and screamed and waved and forced her horse against the flow until the leading edge of the herd, confused by the pressure from both sides at once, began, agonizingly slowly, to bend. For one terrible moment it seemed they would not make it, the front of the herd already nearly level with the split, still running straight for the crossing and the town beyond. And then Joseph did something Teresa would remember for the rest of her life. He drove his horse directly across the herd's leading edge, cutting between the lead steers and the trail toward the crossing, close enough that his stirrup very nearly brushed a set of horns, forcing the frightened animals to shy away from him in the only direction left open to them, which was south, toward the flats, away from the bridge, away from the town. The herd broke that way like water around a rock, the whole brown mass of them thundering past the split and away into open ground where they would run themselves to exhaustion over the following mile with no one and nothing left in their path to harm. And it was only once the dust began to settle, and the roar of hooves faded into the distance that Teresa realized she was shaking again, the same way she had shaken the day the flood nearly took her. Except this time it was not only fear working through her. It was something fiercer, a wild exhilaration at having faced real danger with her own hands and come through whole. Joseph rode back to her at a walk, both their horses blowing hard, dust caking every visible inch of them both. and when he reached her he did not say a word, only reached across and took her hand in his and held it, and let the silence say what neither of them yet had breath for. "That," Walter Whitaker said, arriving beside them at last, gray-faced and grinning despite himself, "is the closest I have come to meeting my Maker since the war, and I do not intend to repeat the experience if this family can help it." Ferris meant that herd to take the bridge down and half the lumber yard with it, Joseph said once he had caught his breath. "He is out of patience and out of legal cover both. He will not send cattle next time, Walter. He will come himself, and soon, because the bridge is nearly finished, and once it opens, his hold on this camp is finished with it." "Then we had better be ready for him," Teresa said, "before he decides the hour of his own choosing." They did not have long to wait, and in the end, it was not Nathaniel Ferris who chose the hour, but the town's own stubborn progress that forced his hand. 2 days later, with the last decking boards nailed into place, and the bridge over Cash Fork standing complete sound, and ready to bear the weight of a loaded freight wagon for the first time in the history of Silver Bend, word came by the same wire that had first warned them, that a shipment of assay office funds and the quarter's mail contract, worth more to Ferris in pride and in coin than any single silver payroll, was due up from Granite Junction the following evening, and that Ferris intended to make an example of the new road before its very first wagon crossed it, to prove to the whole camp that no bridge in the world could keep his grip off Bear Canyon's trade. Joseph decoded the message himself, sitting alone at his key past midnight, and did not wait for morning to bring it to her. He found Teresa still awake at the mercantile, going over the ledgers by lamplight as she so often did when sleep would not come, and she looked up at the sound of the door, reading the set of his shoulders before he said a single word. "Tomorrow night," he said. "Ferris means to burn the bridge and take the shipment both, and he has sent word to Dunlap to keep every deputy in town occupied elsewhere when it happens, so there will be no law standing between him and the crossing, but whoever we can gather ourselves." Teresa closed the ledger slowly. "Then we gather everyone the bridge was built for," she said, "because it was never only mine to defend, Joseph. It belongs to this whole town now, and I think this town has earned the right to say so, out loud, with Ferris standing close enough to hear it." The following evening, as the sun went down gold and peaceful behind the western ridges, the kind of fair, gentle Colorado evening that gave no hint at all of the violence it was about to hold, nearly 30 men and women of Silver Bend gathered quietly in the trees along the near bank of Cash Fork, on Teresa's word and Joseph's careful planning, armed with whatever they owned, shotguns and old cavalry pistols, and in the case of the blacksmith, an iron bar he swore he could put to good use if it came to close quarters. Nathaniel Ferris arrived at the bridge just past dusk with 11 riders, torches already lit among them, plainly intending to see the new crossing burned before the moon had fully risen, and it was Joseph Townsend who stepped out alone onto the near end of the bridge to meet him, rifle in hand, silhouetted against the last violet light in the western sky. "That is far enough, Ferris," Joseph called, his voice carrying clean across the water. "This bridge belongs to Silver Bend now, and every soul in this camp who ever paid your toll unwilling is standing in these trees behind me, and every one of them has decided tonight that they would rather fight for a free road than pay for a stolen one another season." Ferris laughed, short and ugly, though his eyes flicked uneasily toward the tree line, where enough shapes were now visible in the dusk to make his confidence falter. "One telegraph man with a rifle does not frighten me, Townsend." "He is not alone," Teresa said, stepping out of the trees to stand at Joseph's shoulder, her father's revolver steady in her hand, and behind her, as though her voice were the signal they had all been waiting for, 30 townsfolk stepped out of cover together, rifles and shotguns leveled, the torchlight catching on more than 24 grim, determined faces. "And neither is he wrong, Mr. Ferris. There is not a franchise on any county record that gives you the right to this road, or to that one, And Marshall Dunlap's protection has run out along with his credit in this camp, because half the men behind me have already signed sworn statements naming every toll they were forced to pay you and every dollar he took his share of. It was Marshall Otis Dunlap himself, arriving at a gallop from town at that very moment, drawn by word of the gathering, who found himself facing not the quiet compliance he had counted on for over a year, but the leveled weapons of an entire camp that had finally stopped being afraid of him. "Marshal," Teresa said, without lowering her revolver, "you may arrest Nathaniel Ferris for extortion and attempted arson this very night, in front of every witness gathered here. Or you may stand beside him and be arrested yourself the moment the territorial marshal I have already wired for arrives from Denver, because I sent that message 3 days ago, and he is due into Granite Junction on tomorrow's stage." Dunlap's face in the torchlight went the color of old ash. Ferris, seeing the marshal's nerve fail before his own eyes, made one last desperate grab for his pistol, and it was Joseph who was fastest, closing the distance in 2 strides and driving the outlaw from his saddle with a single hard blow before the weapon ever cleared its holster. The 2 men going down together in the dirt at the bridge's edge while the rest of Ferris's riders, seeing their leader beaten and the marshal frozen with indecision, and facing 30 leveled guns besides, threw down their own weapons rather than die for a franchise that had never existed. It was over in less time than it takes to tell it. Nathaniel Ferris disarmed and bound with his own gun belt. Marshall Dunlap too shamed and too outnumbered to do anything but stand aside while the townsfolk of Silver Bend, for the first time in more than a year, took hold of their own road with their own hands. Joseph rose from the dirt, breathing hard, a fresh bruise already darkening along one cheekbone, and turned to find Teresa already moving toward him. And this time there was no hesitation at all in the way she came into his arms, in front of the whole gathered camp, in front of her uncle's astonished but delighted grin, in front of the torchlight and the bridge and the water running quiet beneath it. "You rode out to fight beside me," she said against his shoulder, half laughing, half in tears from the release of it all, "same as you warned me the very first time. I do not think I will ever tire of that, Joseph Townsend." "Then it is fortunate," he murmured into her hair, "that I do not intend to stop for as long as you will have me riding beside you." The territorial marshal did indeed arrive from Denver 2 days later, summoned by Teresa's careful, patient wire correspondence, and found more than enough sworn testimony waiting for him, backed by assay office deposit slips and a false county franchise Joseph had already proven fraudulent, to see Nathaniel Ferris bound over for trial and Marshall Otis Dunlap stripped of his badge before the week was out. Mayor Guilful, chastened and eager to be seen doing right by a camp that had watched him fail to do so for over a year, appointed a temporary peace officer from among the townsfolk that very same week, a steady, sober miner named Cobb who had no history of taking Ferris's coin and every intention of keeping it that way. The bridge over Cash Fork opened formally to freight traffic on a bright, ordinary Tuesday morning, with no ceremony beyond Walter Whittaker driving the very first loaded wagon across its new boards himself, grinning the whole way. And by that afternoon 3 other freight outfits from Granite Junction had already sent word that they intended to use the new North Bench Road rather than pay Bear Canyon's toll a single week longer, a toll that, with Ferris in custody and his men scattered, no one remained to collect in any case. Silver Bend's freight rates dropped within a month by nearly a third, and the Whittaker Mercantile and Freight Company, no longer bleeding money to extortion, found itself with more contracts than Walter Whittaker's careful, cautious hand could properly manage alone, a problem Teresa solved by quietly, formally taking over the company's freight operations herself, with her uncle's full and grateful blessing, her name now standing alongside her father's on every contract the business signed. It was on a warm evening some 3 weeks after the bridge's opening, the 2 of them walking the same creek bank where they had first kissed, the water low and gentle now with the spring runoff long past, that Joseph Townsend stopped, took both her hands in his, and said the thing he had apparently been working up the courage to say for several days running. "I have been offered a position," he said, "guiding freight and cattle contracts along the new road as far as the rail depot at Granite Junction, and further besides. If the camps south of here keep growing the way this territory seems bent on growing. It would mean time on the trail again, Teresa, weeks at a stretch some seasons, though never so far I could not always find my way home to you. And you are asking whether I would mind that," she said. "I am asking," Joseph said, and here his voice roughened, unsteady in a way she had rarely heard from him, "whether you would consider coming with me, not merely waiting on my return, but writing the contracts yourself the way you have always understood them better than any man I have met, so that Whittaker Freight becomes the outfit every camp in this territory trusts to move their silver and their mail and their lives safely, with the two of us seeing to it together, side by side. The way we fought that road free in the first place. I love you, Teresa. I have loved you, I think, since before I had words enough to know what the feeling was, back when we were children chasing barn cats in Missouri, and I have loved you every day since that horse near carried you into the flood, and I do not want to build a life that keeps us apart even half the year when I have finally found my way back to you after 15 years of not knowing where you had gone." Teresa felt her eyes sting, and did not bother hiding it, because there was no one left in her life she trusted more completely to see her cry without thinking less of her for it. "I love you too, Joseph Townsend," she said, "and I will not have you thinking for one moment that I intend to stay behind mending ledgers while you ride off to build the very future I have spent my whole life training for. Ask me the question you are actually working up to, if you please, because I believe you have gone the long way around it." Joseph laughed, startled and delighted, and dropped to one knee right there on the creek bank with the water running soft behind him and the stars beginning to show overhead in a sky as fair and gentle as the one that had watched over them since the day her horse first bolted toward the flood. "Teresa Whittaker," he said, "will you marry me and ride the whole of this territory with me, and let me spend the rest of my life being the man who rides out beside you whatever comes?" "Yes," she said, laughing and crying both at once, pulling him up by the lapels before he had even fully risen. "Yes, Joseph, 1,000 times yes, though I warn you now I intend to negotiate every contract we sign together, and I do not intend to lose a single one." "I would not have you any other way," he said, and kissed her there in the starlight, the creek running quiet and clear behind them, the bridge they had built together standing solid and sure not a quarter-mile downstream, carrying the whole future of Silver Bend across water that had once nearly taken her life, and had instead, in the strangest and most fortunate turning, given her back the one man in all the world she had never stopped, in some quiet corner of her heart, hoping to find again. They were married 3 weeks later in the still unfinished shell of the Miners' Hall, with half the town in attendance and Walter Whittaker giving the bride away with tears he made no effort to hide, and Petey Coombs ringing the telegraph office's brass bell in wild, joyful clangor. The moment the preacher pronounced them wed, they did not linger long in Silver Bend afterward to settle into any quiet, fixed life, for that had never been the shape of what either of them wanted from this new chapter. Within the month, Teresa Whittaker Townsend and Joseph Townsend rode out together down the new North Bench Road, past the bridge that bore silent witness to everything they had built and fought for, bound for Granite Junction and the string of growing camps beyond it. Freight contracts folded carefully in Teresa's saddlebag, Joseph's rifle riding easy across his saddle bow, two capable, devoted people setting out side by side to build a business and a life, and a partnership neither danger nor doubt would ever again be strong enough to break apart.